Welcome everyone, Costin here on Serious Gaming with a campaign guide for Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2, based on my experiences playing the Imperium campaign on the hard difficulty. And although there are unique aspects to both the Necrons and Tyranids, I feel most of what I'm about to say will apply very well for both of those factions. Worth keeping in mind that the Imperium starts with the worst possible start of any of the three factions. They are fighting the most entrenched enemy. Chaos has a very strong presence, far stronger than the enemies the Tyranids and Necrons face in the first sector do. And you, on top of that, you as the player have very limited resources. In the sense, sure, you start with two resource-producing planets, a Hive World in Belisar, and a Forge World in Demius Binary, but you also have severe disadvantages in gaining more resources, because the only other two resource-producing planets are in Xerxia and in Cantrell, so another Hive World, another Forge World. You also waste 2 turns because this also acts like a tutorial, and the game is forcing you to make very specific moves. So this is how my Adeptus Astartes fleet ended up in Costin, how my Mechanicus and Imperial Navy fleets are still in Demius Binary, why I wasted an entire turn with my fleets doing nothing, by the way, and built a minefield that wasted resources, as well as an escort vessel for Admiral Spire. Significant waste of resources and time all around. The Chaos Forces start at a pretty high threat level of 9 to begin with, so you don't really have any advantages, except of the fact that you do have 3 fleets, but that doesn't really amount to much because of how because the enemy can build minefields. So enemies can build defenses, and the more turns you take, the stronger those defenses will be. So they can build minefields, which prevents you from bringing a 3rd fleet. So the 3rd fleet advantage is gone down the drain. Then they can build defense platforms and space stations, mobile defenses, making it very difficult. It's not so much about destroying them, but how the game works. I'll get into that in just a bit. The only other advantage is the fact you start with a cruiser. So Necrons, for instance, start with 2 light cruisers. You start with 2 light cruisers, 2 escorts, and 1 cruiser. So you do start with a more powerful fleet overall, or more powerful forces overall, but a light cruiser for the Necrons is not the same as a light cruiser for the Imperium. It's far more powerful than that, isn't it? A light cruiser for the Necrons can stand toe-to-toe with battle cruisers, let alone enemy cruisers. I mean, they won't necessarily win, but they'll certainly give them a good run for their money. And then the Tyranids, well, the Tyranids have a 70% win rate in multiplayer, so that should give you an idea. Indeed, I think I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here when we're talking about campaign advantages. So I have a save here. This is the first turn of the Necron campaign. On hard difficulty, there are 1 fleet with 247, another with 245, a system that's unoccupied. You can attack and take any of the systems here. And you know what? With your starting fleets, maybe a bit reinforced after 1 turn or 2 turns, you would be able to win most of the battles with relative ease. The only exception is the Battle of Hydra Cordatus, which would actually be a challenge. But outside of that, you would stand a fairly good chance at winning. Notwithstanding the fact that you can also get the 3rd fleet from the very get-go, you do have the resources for it. And on top of that, Necrons also gain an advantage in terms of gaining some resources just by merely capturing a system. Now, let me load a proper campaign and talk about about another severe disadvantage that the Imperium has in its campaign and why it makes it the most difficult in my opinion. Okay, the Imperium campaign is not just, oh, you have the Imperial Navy. You have the Imperial Navy, the Adeptus Astartes, and the Adeptus Mechanicus. If people are wondering how I've gotten fleets over the fleet limit, it's because there was an objective, a bonus objective. The ones in blue are bonus, gold is main objectives, right? The ones that will lead you to completing the game. Anyway, there was a bonus objective that when I completed it, I got free. I got several fleets for free from the game. They weren't worth much, like there weren't good ships in them, but they were still fleets that I could build ships in, and I've been using them. But the real problem here is the Adeptus Astartes, and they suck. Like, Necrons are powerful, Tyranids are exceptionally powerful, Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus are fine, right? Are average, so to speak. Medium to long range with the Imperial Navy, long range with Adeptus Mechanicus, yes. But the Adeptus Astartes style just doesn't translate very well, especially when you're talking about the campaign, especially when you're talking about that campaign on hard difficulty, because you will generally be outnumbered. The enemy will have either bigger or better ships than you, or more ships than you. And the playstyle of the Adeptus Astartes is a playstyle based around boarding actions. Now, boarding actions can be exceptionally powerful. It's actually what makes the Tyranids so dangerous. But the Adeptus Astartes are not in the same category as they are, because they don't have the boarding actions that are as good. They're also limited by the high cost of some of their ships. Their ships are not as durable as some other factions. So for instance, a light cruiser costs 165 or 184, 172. A cruiser can cost over 200. So they have some fairly high costs, and their battleship equivalent can cost as much as a Necron one. Think on that for a second. They are not on the level of a Necron ship. They don't have enough launch bay capabilities to really use those to be a carrier force, or even if it was just for the sake of boarding action. They still are limited by the fact that they only have 3 boarding actions per ship. And on this kind of difficulty, when you're dealing with a lot of ship numbers, they're just not good enough. And this is a major problem because you're limited. You're going to be limited in the number of fleets you have, and you're going to have to deal with a lot of trouble spots. So effectively, if you're playing the Imperium, a third of your entire military force is useless in major military engagements. I mean, the Space Marines can do relatively fine against both Chaos and Necrons, but they will get smashed to pieces by anyone else, including the Eldar. They can win against Eldar, but this is a fairly ugly affair, because Eldar can do a lot of damage from a relatively good distance. Yes, Space Marine ships are faster than typical Imperial Navy ships, but they don't have as much HP, though they do have more armor. They would just get torn to shreds, which is, as you might imagine, a fairly significant problem. You can't afford to lose precious ships. You need to fight from a distance, or you need to fight very intelligently. With Adeptus Astartes, you effectively need to get very close to the enemy and do boarding actions with limited boarding attempts. What makes the Tyranids so great with their boarding actions is not just the fact that they actually do have really great craft for that kind of affair, but beyond that, they have a really good angle from which to land their own boarding actions. And their boarding actions are exceptionally deadly. So that's one problem. Now, when you're talking about Imperial Navy, though, and Adeptus Mechanicus, the 2 quote-unquote good fleets that you'll have, well, the playstyle I would recommend people develop, regardless of what they're playing, be it Tyranid, Necrons, or Imperium, is you need to realize, okay, what's my strength? Every fleet in this game, every faction in this game, is based around something that will just decimate the enemy very quickly. For Tyranids, it's their boarding actions and their ram damage. It's very dangerous. They have the best ramming attack in the game. Though they'll take a lot of damage in their own right, the ability to just land very quick ramming attacks the way they do it gives them a fairly significant advantage. With the Necrons, it's Scarab Swarms and Star Pulse Generator, so AoE abilities, close range. It's also the ability of something like Astral Recall, which allows you to teleport your entire fleet on your flagship. That's certainly an advantage. With the Imperial Navy and the Adeptus Mechanicus, Adeptus Astartes being at an overall significant disadvantage, even though they do have supposedly one advantage in not having a morale system, so their fleet won't ever break. But beyond that, they just don't have the damage, they don't have the necessary boarding actions, they don't even have the assault craft. The Imperial Navy has the advantage in a sense of versatility with their ships. If I look over here at what I can get 4 types of battleships, 3 Grand Cruisers. I wouldn't recommend bothering with the Grand Cruisers. They're too expensive for what they offer. I'd say focus on battle cruisers or battleships. I mean, they're just slightly cheaper than a battleship, more expensive than a battle cruiser, and both a battle cruiser and battleship is going to offer you more for your money. But when you're looking at this, you have a close range fighter with the Retribution type battleship with torpedoes. You have, well, the Emperor is one you can ignore. It's the most expensive one and arguably the most useless one. But Apocalypse is more long range with lance batteries, a Nova cannon, and heavy macro turret. Then the Oberon, which is in almost every way better than Emperor. The Oberon will give you a long range launch platform. Yes, it does have more limited launch base, but it's a lot more long range option of a battleship. Versatility is great. And versatility is important because you actually want to use the various options, but it basically breaks down into 3 big categories: Nova cannons, torpedoes, and fighters. Those are the 3 things you should look at. There's also a discussion about lance batteries and macro batteries, but that's less significant than the decision between torpedoes, fighters, and Nova cannons. In most engagements, Nova cannons are going to be your go-to weapon. This is the one advantage of the Imperial Navy. This is their super weapon, at least when dealing with smaller ships. And the reason is that a fleet packed with Nova cannons will decimate very large enemy forces. And on top of that, because of the range available, you can conduct hit and run attacks. I've begun doing that in this campaign that I've been playing. You can check that on my channel. I've been doing hit and run attacks with Nova cannons. Torpedoes are great, but only really for bigger ships, and not because of the regular torpedoes, but because of the Melta torpedoes. I have a battle here in Bellis Corona to take out the Ancient One, which is going to take out the Tyranids effectively. I did this battle, I uploaded this to my channel, I loaded the save just before that, and the way I took it down was use a good amount of torpedoes to Melta torpedoes to burn it down. Now, the Adeptus Mechanicus have ships that are more long range. Almost all of the ships but actually all the ships except light cruisers have Nova cannons. So they're more long range. They're not quite as durable as the Imperial Navy, as they don't have torpedoes, but when you're talking about most of the fleet battles you'll be fighting, at least most of the fleet battles I've been fighting in the campaign so far, these guys are going to be your go-to. They're not going to be as good as the Imperial Navy because of the lack of torpedoes when dealing with some of the super ships, like the Ancient One for the Tyranids or whatever, the Necrons, the Orcs, the Eldar have. I think the Eldar have a craft world, but they will be a go-to affair. Now, obviously, you will have more options with Imperial Navy than you will with any other faction. Or you'll have more options, I should say, with the Imperium, because you have 3 separate fleets under your command with different strengths and weaknesses. It's just disappointing because the Adeptus Astartes have been in a pretty bad spot for a while and they just don't work well. You're going to use the Adeptus Astartes basically in a support role. It's not the problem anyone else has because obviously they don't have to deal with this. I think it would have been better if they had allowed, to at least an extent, if they had forced the player, okay, you need to have this amount of fleets of, say, Adeptus Astartes and mechanics. You can't just go one way or another completely, but it would have been nice to be able to have more fleets of Adeptus Mechanicus and Imperial Navy instead of having to have a third of my strength being wasted on Adeptus Astartes ships. And it would also make sense lore-wise, because the Adeptus Astartes are not supposed to be that numerous when it comes to naval strength. They're certainly not a third of the Imperium naval power. Now, with that in mind, when it comes to playing the campaign, there are two things you need to consider here. Three big things. Resources, how quickly can you get access to systems with resources? You want to get those resources quickly, you want to focus on those systems. So if you're playing Imperial Navy, you want to get Xerxia and Cantrell as quickly as possible, then worry about Cadia. Because Cadia doesn't give you a resource bonus, and because resources are going to be a problem. And you want to defend those systems above all else. In this particular campaign, the system that's generating a quarter of my entire income, or close to it, is Agrippina. And it's mostly doing it through, forget mostly, because I don't think there's any real bonuses anywhere that it's getting from other systems, though there are some bonuses adjacent systems can give to boost income. I don't think Agrippina has that. Agrippina, though, is a forge world. It has an industrial world, civilized world here. And basically when you're looking at this, you're looking at a system that can generate a huge amount of money. Not every system matters, though obviously having control of an entire sector is very useful for two reasons. Bonuses that you get for your all of your fleets, regardless of where they're stationed, and because it reduces the threat level of the enemies within a sector completely. Now, I'm not in full control of the Agrippina sector, because there is a system here that's not available for me right now. I think that's because of the fact that one of those systems is going to have a special mission that's going to open up later on, that I'll get to later on there. Now, the way threat level works in the game, and also a reason you want to rush and take as many systems as possible, the way threat level works, the higher it gets, and it will get higher depending on your urgency meter. I'll talk about that in a second. But the higher it gets, or the higher it is, the more the chance the enemy can take actions like assaulting systems, reinforcing fleets, making more ships, that kind of stuff. So you want to take as many systems within a sector as quickly as possible. But key point here, you want to avoid opening more sectors for as much as possible. And the reason is that you want to be in a really good position when you open new sectors, so that you can do the same. So you can rush into a new sector, take as much of that as possible. Because when a new sector opens up, that sector is not going to be heavily fortified. Yes, there will be enemy fleets, but only a handful, if any, will have defenses built up. And I'm talking here minefields, defense platforms, and space stations, which would make it far more difficult to assault them. So in this particular case, you can look at this system of Scarus. Many of the planet, which opened some time ago, but they've been fighting and butchering each other, there aren't many defenses built up. If you open new systems, and you open new systems by completing main campaign objectives, so I've delayed doing the Medusa mission. I would easily do it. It's not a difficult one, considering the fleets I have available at my disposal at the moment. I've avoided doing that specifically because I want to avoid having new systems open up. It would just make things more difficult. So you will start in Cadia, and your first objective in Cadia will be to take many, but not all, of the planets within the sector. Then you'll get an objective to fight a battle in Cadia. Before you do so, you will want to take all of the Cadian sector, build it up, and then go on. Regarding the urgency meter, now the urgency meter comes into play here. There is an option to disable it. The developers have strongly recommended that you don't. I'm going to work under the assumption that people are going to play with it on. And I personally would also recommend people play with it on, because this is not supposed to be some comfortable game. This is supposed to be the desperate years of where mankind fights for survival, not just mankind. So the urgency meter works like this. You have 3 tiers. For each tier, the threat level gets higher. And once you get to the last tier, to I guess tier 4, you lose the campaign. So you obviously want to avoid filling this up. Hell, you want to avoid getting to tier 1 because you don't want to deal with that extra threat level. Now, obviously, playing on a difficulty like hard, the threat level is going to be on its own by its very nature on a higher level, just by default there, than it would be otherwise. But anyway, you want to avoid this. There's only really one way to, no, or there are two ways to handle this. One is complete objectives, not necessarily main objectives. Side objectives will do as well. Like in this case, I have 3 objectives to optional objectives. I don't have to do these, but if I do any of these, the urgency meter will reset. And this is something you should use and abuse as a player. So if you're starting an Imperium campaign, you want to take as much of Cadia as you can before this meter becomes a problem, then reset it, then build up, then take the rest of Cadia or develop some of these systems. You want to spend your resources developing resource planets. That's your main focus. Then worry about other planets. So say for instance, this is a penal world, increases troop regeneration, not particularly useful right now. Or this is Death World, increases critical assault chance of Imperial Navy ships created in this sector by 10%. Again, not the priority. Priority is resources. Secondary priority are listening post systems, which will give you one battle plan, which you can use to lower the urgency meter, and also you can use battle plans to prevent enemy attacks on your system. So in this case, I have a Terran fleet. Use that. It's delayed by 1 turn. Very useful, very important to keep that in mind. The enemy can launch attacks regardless though of your threat level, even if it's 0 or even if it's 1. They can launch attacks at random in any place, any system. It's kind of a bit of an annoying factor that it means you will have to have garrison fleets, or at least a defense force that will run intervention. There are also systems like Jubal, which has this debuff Drukhari raids. Unless one of your fleets is stationed in the system, not the sector, so the system, so you need to have a fleet here in Jubal, then there's a 20% probability of the system being targeted by an invasion of Drukhari ships. There's the same thing in Agrippina with Arilla Bay, which is a pirate world. There's a 20% chance of the system being targeted by invasion of Imperial pirate ships. The Imperial pirate ships are basically Imperial Navy ships just gone rogue. Like you can see, these are the guys right here in gray. Those are not friendlies. Those are traitors and heretics that need to be punished. So this is what you're gonna be dealing with. You want to take as many systems as possible, but you don't want to complete objectives as quickly as possible. You want to delay with that. You don't want the enemy to be entrenched. You also don't want to complete objectives too quickly, because you might complete an objective, then the next objective after that, after the meter is reset, might be beyond your reach, in which case, if you don't have battle plans, you might just end up losing the campaign. So those are the things you have to worry about as a player. Now follow that and you will have a great deal of success. Try and have balanced fleets. Try and not just put all your eggs in one basket. Of course, the one exception probably being your faction leader's fleet, in this case Admiral Spire, because if you lose your admiral, you will lose the campaign. Even if he's just, defeated in battle. If his ship is destroyed, you lose the campaign. That kind of creates problems, because there are many battles where you have to take your admiral, especially quest battles when you're looking at that. So your admiral is going to have the best of the best that you can marshal from your military forces, but you can't just ignore other systems. Beyond that, a couple of ideas when dealing with the bosses. So the ancient one in here, like as I've said, torpedoes, Nova cannons. If you're playing Necrons, as an example, Star Pulse, Scarabs. If you're playing Tyranids and you have to deal with some bosses, boarding actions. Boarding actions work regardless of the faction you're playing, but I feel that the Tyranids have a much better chance than anyone else, because their boarding actions are just so potent to use. But those are the areas you should focus on. With the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus, it's torpedoes or Nova cannons, with some, however many you can get, some fighter craft, some fighter craft, some bombers, some assault boats. Even if it's just a distraction for torpedoes, it can do some damage, but you don't really want to focus on that. You don't want a fleet of bombers as the Imperial Navy. It will not necessarily work very well for you. You just don't have the best bombers in the game, and it's a limited resource. Beyond that, well, I think I've said all I had to say on this particular subject. One thing to note is the way the Renown system works before I end this video. So Renown is your leveling system. The more you get, the more you level, and the more you level, the more fleets you'll have available to you, the more upgrades you'll have available. Upgrades are dependent on your ship's level, so if you have a level 2 upgrade, it will only apply to level 2 ships. Same with level 3 upgrades with level 3 ships. So you want to keep your ships alive. Then there's fleet capacity for each individual fleet, and then leadership. Leadership is the total military strength you can bring in a particular battle. There are certain upgrades which can only be acquired from certain systems. There's a limit to how many upgrades. You won't be able to unlock everything, so you want to be smart about this. You don't want to waste your points on stuff that isn't necessarily that useful. So for instance, auxiliary power relays, yes, it can be useful in certain situations, but I prefer the optimized plasma thrusters, and then eventually I'll get the pattern drive over here, which increases ship speed by 25% flat out. So the upgrades at the bottom are really worth it. For the most part, not necessarily all of them, like chapter relics, critical assault chance of the ship is increased by 10%, applies to Adeptus Astartes flagships. It still doesn't make them good enough to really use, though it obviously gives them a bonus. This, by the way, is how you play the campaign. You pay attention to some of these bonuses and you build ships in systems that have these on certain planets, like Cadia, for instance, or Agrippina. You focus on that as opposed to other systems. You don't just build on random, because there's a lot of bonuses you can gain for a particular fleet or a particular ship that you want to keep in mind. Now, regarding the Renown system, you gain Renown winning battles, losing battles though. And by losing battles, that's actually a key point to make here, because you can run a guerrilla style warfare. You can go and attack an enemy, use your long range weaponry, or use your AoE attacks if you're Necron, or use some boarding actions, warp your fleet out, not lose a single ship. Yes, take some damage, especially from the warp itself. Try and avoid taking as much damage from the enemy fleet as possible. Do some damage, get out, and you will gain a lot of renown for that, especially if you're sending your fleets in turn. So for instance, I have this Adeptus Mechanicus fleet. I've been using this fleet to do a lot of damage to the free orc fleet stationed here, and I've gained hundreds of renown per each of the lost battle that I've gone for. So don't just assume that if you're playing the campaign, the only way to play it is to have to win every battle. No, you can lose battles. Hell, you might play deliberately to lose certain battles in order to abuse the renown system. This is the key point. The urgency meter, the economic system, the fleet system, the renown system, everything. When you're looking at this game, look at what you can exploit, look at what you can abuse, look at what can work for you so that you gain an advantage, because the game is not going to be kind and gentle to you. Take for instance the Tyranids. I've pushed them back, but the Tyranids, when they showed up for me, they launched like something along the lines of 8 individual attacks with fleets made up of, well, thousands of light cruisers and escort vessels, and that was just the first wave. The second wave, they launched 3 individual attacks, 3,000 fleet points each, so 9,000 points in total, 9 fleets made up of capital ships. That was a nightmare to push back. In fact, I lost one of these systems. I lost Bellux Corona that they were targeting. So you need to be smart, you need to be clever, you need to conserve your resources. The AI has a lot more than you do. You're the one that's struggling for resources. Even if that resource is only the fact, like I have a lot of income, I've been having a lot of income for a while now, I'm drowning in resources to an extent. But my problem is I've reached my fleet limit, I have to defend all of these systems are under attack. You need to be aggressive as a player, you can't let the enemy gain a foothold. If you can avoid that fight tooth and nail without losing ships, just I feel that's kind of basic stuff in a sense. But anyway, that's all I had to say here. Costin here on Serious Gaming signing out. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for more. And if you do like my content, please do consider watching my Let's Play of Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2. I'll be finishing the Imperial Navy in a couple of days from this upload, and then I'll probably start on the Necron campaign, and after that, the Tyranid campaign. Costin here, signing out.